A centuries-old controversial statue in Barbados comes down. A lobby in St. Vincent for a new statue to go up. And cases of COVID-19 at schools in Guyana and a spike in TNT's maximum security prison. I'm Renee Sion, following some of the big stories across the region in this Caribbean Week in Review. A controversial 207-year-old statue came down in Barbados to cheers from Barbadians who had long called for its removal. The statue of British Admiral Lord Horatio Nelson was removed from the capital Bridgetown in a symbolic break from the country's colonial past. It happened just about 2 months after government announced plans to replace Britain's Queen Elizabeth as the head of state and make Barbados a republic. The statue of Nelson was unveiled in 1813 to commemorate the British Royal Navy's victory over the French and Spanish in the Battle of Trafalgar 8 years prior. But because of Nelson's defense of the slave trade, historians and other Barbadians have insisted he did not belong in a place that is now called Heroes Square, where he stood opposite portraits of the island's national heroes. Following protests and petitions earlier this year, the government answered the calls and Nelson was removed on November 16, a day designated by the United Nations as International Day of Tolerance. We get more in this report from CBC's Ryan Broom.
It was just after 4 p.m. when the 200-year-old statue was lifted from its base, after workmen had earlier drilled around the support of its foundation. It was then secured and loaded onto a truck to be taken to the Barbados Museum. Now, addressing the crowd as the preparation and removal of the statue took place behind her, Prime Minister Motley said consciousness and identity are at the very core of nation states.
A country does not reach 54 years old without having difficult conversations. And I ask us to recognize that these conversations must be had in our homes, in our communities, in our churches, and in our nation. Because life is simply not about the earning of money, but it is about the well-being and the welfare of both the spirit and the body at the same time. And a country that does not take care of its spirit is doomed, because at the end of the day, it is the spirit that gives us the resilience to fight each and every battle.
The Prime Minister also gave an indication that some consideration may be given to renaming one of the island's popular bus stands.
We need to rename the bus stand after Granville Williams. Not simply because of his relationship with transport, because he didn't have that. But it was his relationship with trying to find public spaces in which he could create that space for people to lift up their hands and to praise their God in the way that they wanted to do, not in the way that they were required to do through the establishment of the church in this country.
Meanwhile, Prime Minister Motley also signaled that significant progress has also been made for plans to develop nearby historic Golden Square.
The framework for the work to continue to ensure that Golden Square will be a properly landscaped park in the center of town, reminding us that those who gathered on that site 83 years ago acted deliberately in our interests by putting their lives and their property at risk when they so gathered. There are too many Barbadians, young and old, who do not even know where Golden Square is as we speak today. And it is a condemnation on our nation-building project that we could be 54 years into independence without people appreciating what started it all in Golden Square.
For the time being, the statue of Lord Horatio Nelson will remain at the Barbados Museum.
While over in St. Vincent and the Grenadines, there's been a call for the erection of a statue honoring the country's sole national hero. I spoke to a local activist, Akley Olton, who says the time is right for that discussion. You've been very vocal across social media calling for the inclusion of actually having your national heroes be shown across the islands. So, what message are you really trying to get across, and whose attention are you trying to get?
Well, where the world is right now, and the I guess the tension that's revolve around racism, and also the recognition of the rights of indigenous people. St. Vincent and the Grenadines was actually one of the last places to be colonized in the Caribbean, and it was because there was a strong force of indigenous people who were fighting the colonials and kept them at bay for more than 200 years, the Garifuna. The only national hero of St. Vincent is called Joseph Chatoyer, and we do not have a monument in his image. We are cut off completely from our indigenous heritage, and what we have as a replacement is statues similar to Nelson. We have a statue in Kingston called the Iron Man, and I mean, in some ways, it is good to be a part of the movement of self-emancipating, and taking down statues. But we are not even calling for destroying or for taking down. What we are calling for is for creating, because we feel our indigenous people should be respected enough, and there should be monuments to honor them and to allow their memory to live amongst us. So if they're going to keep the statue of the white colonial Iron Man, put up a statue of my hero, put up a statue of the person who died to defend freedom before colonization. So that's what I'm trying to share, and it's for whoever is interested in this kind of narrative, and protecting the rights of indigenous people or remembering their memories. That's who I'm trying to communicate with.
Okay, and so far, is there anyone that actually responded? Is there a movement happening in St. Vincent where there be more people like you that are actually making this call?
There are a lot of people who are talking about it and who are discussing it, because rightly so, the time is ripe for that kind of discussion. And even before the removal of the statue in Barbados, other persons from Barbados had also invited me into the conversation with them about, the Caribbean cleaning up its image and cutting itself away from this, colonial subjugation. It's time we start recognizing the value that we have as societies that emerged out of slavery, and stop using it as, our point of departure.
Okay, thank you so much for talking to us, Akley, and we do hope we wish you the best in your movement, and we keep in touch and see how it's going. Guyana's main opposition is trying to get Tourism Minister Onij Waldron removed as a member of parliament because she had dual citizenship when she was appointed. Court proceedings were filed on November 18th by Opposition Chief Whip Christopher Jones through Attorney-at-Law Senior Counsel Roysdale Ford, who is also an opposition member of parliament. Ford said enough time had been given for the Speaker of the National Assembly and the minister herself to act on a revelation that she was still a U.S. citizen at the time she became a member of parliament. Under Guyana's constitution, people with dual citizenship are not allowed to serve in the National Assembly, and the opposition is seeking a court declaration to force the tourism minister to step down from her current position.
We have decided that we have waited patiently, and we have waited enough to afford the Speaker of the National Assembly the opportunity to take a decision with respect to the continued occupation of a seat by Ms. Onij Waldron in the National Assembly. We also think that we have been patient enough to permit Ms. Onij Waldron herself to reflect on the fact that she currently does not occupy any position in the National Assembly which is premised or rested on any constitutional standing. If we go back further in time to the 5th of August, you would remember that Ms. Onij Waldron solemnly took an oath to become a minister of government. The Constitution requires Article 103 and Article 105 indicate and provide that you must be able to be qualified to be elected as a minister and or a member of the National Assembly. On that date, 5th of August, Ms. Onij Waldron was incapable of seriously taking that oath because she was still a citizen of the United States.
We'll be back with more after this break.
Your trip to Grenada is never complete without a visit to Carriacou and Petite Martinique, without a stop on one of our white sand beaches that disappear in oceans, with beautiful coral reefs and perfect diving conditions. You can't possibly leave without exploring a culture so pure and full of fascinating traditions, without experiencing and exploring the real definition of island life. Just when you thought paradise couldn't get any better, our sister isles reset your expectations. Visit puregrenada.com or call your preferred travel agent today.
The Guyana Teachers Union is calling on the Ministry of Education to close schools across the country. This follows confirmation from the Ministry of Education that 32 students have tested positive for COVID-19 since the partial reopening of schools on November 9th. We get the details from Amel Griffith of HGP Nightly News.
President of the GTU, Mark Light, in a phone interview with this newscast on Wednesday, is adamant that serious consideration should be given to closing of the schools.
The union is of the view that the schools where dorms are attached should be closed so that the students who have tested positive can have the time to quarantine, and also their families and other teachers can be tested.
The GTU also called for the careful monitoring of the schools located within COVID-19 hotspots. On Tuesday, Minister of Education Prem Manikchan stated that 5 teachers, 2 ancillary staff, and 6 students tested positive at Bartica Region 7. However, on Wednesday, the Minister of Health, during his daily COVID-19 update, confirmed that 32 students had tested positive, but are all being closely monitored.
Since we have started this exercise, we've had, I would say, about 32 children that we've identified, but they've all been looked after and they're all being monitored.
Minister Anthony said that none of the cases recorded so far have been displaying any symptoms.
Once we identify a positive child, there are 2 options. If they came in from very far away, their parents were informed, so that the team in that location can do contact tracing and inform those persons who might have been in contact with that child. And of course, to inform the family about the status of the child.
Parents were given the option of having the children who tested positive either go to an isolation facility or return home, where they are expected to be quarantined for 10 to 14 days. Students who traveled from the hinterland to attend school in Region 4 and later tested positive are being isolated at a Diamond Hospital, Dr. Anthony said. 8 students from the Cato Secondary School had traveled to Region 4 to attend President's College during this period. All public secondary schools reopened on November 9, 2020, allowing 21,000 students to return for face-to-face learning, just as Guyana saw a sustained increase in daily cases of COVID-19.
Trinidad and Tobago reported an increase in COVID-19 cases in its maximum security prison. The prison service said that 68 more prisoners had tested positive. That followed 18 positive tests returned the week before, which triggered contact tracing and further testing of 222 inmates as well as some members of the staff. Acting Commissioner of the Prisons Dennis Pulchan admitted the situation is unsettling, but he said all avenues were being explored to protect the rest of the prison population, and he insisted that the situation is under control. The first batch of COVID-19 positive prisoners who had tested positive have been housed at a facility that is now at full capacity. But the prison chief said the latest 68 to test positive were moved to a secure location in the prison that is on par with the Health Ministry's recommended parallel health facilities.
These inmates are now housed at a particular part of the prison that is very secure and inaccessible to many. The capacity there is great. We have the capacity of about 270 beds that we can use safely.
But Executive Director of the Caribbean Center of Human Rights, Denise Pitcher, called on the government to continue releasing non-violent prisoners to help curb the spread of the virus in the prison.
We are advocating, or we are urging the government to release these persons that were identified for early release. The public should also note that these persons are committed non-violent offenses and minor offenses. So they're not at risk to the public, or they don't pose a threat to the public.
Meantime, Jamaica this past week surpassed 10,000 positive COVID-19 cases. It's the first CARICOM nation to pass the 10,000 mark. The number of deaths have also been increasing. More than 230 people have died so far. We'll be back with a special sports segment after this break. Time now for sports. Plans are being made to have the inaugural Caribbean Games in 2022, with the COVID-19 pandemic forcing the Caribbean Association of National Olympic Committees, CANOC, to postpone the event. CANOC President Brian Lewis says Guadeloupe, where the event was to be held from June to July 2021, has committed to hosting the Games. It has proposed several dates which CANOC members now have to choose from. This was among developments coming out of the CANOC's annual general meeting on November 18th, which Caribbean's Weekend Review's Don Paris spoke to CANOC's president about in this week's featured sports interview.
Okay, Mr. Lewis, thanks for joining us. Just on the heels of the Caribbean Association of National Olympic Committees, CANOC, holding its AGM. First of all, how has the COVID-19 pandemic affected CANOC's operations and sports in the region generally, and how has the organization responded to that?
Well, to be very candid with you, sports globally has been turned upside down, literally. Sports has basically come to a standstill. In particular, the recreational amateur sport, as you know it. I mean, the professional sport has gotten back up in what they call the bubble. But on the ground level, so to speak, at the grassroots level, sport has been basically shut down. And in that regard, from a Caribbean perspective, it has been debilitating, without overstating it. It's been tremendously traumatic. When you add in the public health guidelines and regulations about, not congregating, maintaining social distance, and wear a mask, those three things in and of itself are counter to sport. But let me quickly say that at the end of the day, sport has to do its part. The priority is saving lives, staying healthy. So we do recognize that in sport, that there is a bigger picture that we all have to contribute to fighting COVID-19 and stopping the infection rate.
Okay, you just had your first virtual AGM, and of course the reason it had to be virtual is the same reason the Caribbean Games planned next year had to be postponed. So I imagine that was among the talking points at the meeting. Was a decision made on the way forward in terms of new dates for the Games?
Well, in the contact of, yes, let me just say quickly that it's the first ever virtual annual general meeting hosted by CANOC. The original intention was that St. Lucia will host the AGM, but they were incredibly supportive and collaborative in understanding the impact of COVID-19. And so, yeah, we had our first virtual annual general meeting. And they, to me, they having that virtual AGM was also about sending us a clear signal that regardless of how negatively impactful COVID-19 has been, the Caribbean Association of National Olympic Committees and the Caribbean Olympic Movement, we are determined to not just survive, but to thrive post-COVID. There were a number of major decisions made and issues raised and addressed, and they include the Caribbean Games, which has been impacted by COVID-19. Guadeloupe was the host, and they were supposed to host it in 2021. But of course, they are dependent on France, and it's well known the measures that France have had to take to combat the second wave. So the bottom line is that the Caribbean Games will not be held in 2021. This is the second time in the history of the Caribbean Games that a major H1N1 was what stopped the games from being held in Trinidad and Tobago in 2009. So yes, the games will not be held in 2021, but Guadeloupe have been very supportive and committed, and they have put forward 3 alternative dates in 2022, which will now be considered by the CANOC members to decide which day in 2022 they would much prefer.
And finally, Mr. Lewis, what about your attempts to lobby for inclusion of CANOC associate members into Pan Am sports? What progress has been made there?
Well, it's been a long road on that. The associate members, some of the smaller countries that are not necessarily Olympic sports, so they're outside of the tent. CANOC, of course, because they are members of CANOC, CANOC would have successfully lobbied the Central, it used to be the Central American and Caribbean Sport Organization. It's now rebranded as Central Caribbean Sport, to have associate members included. We have not been as successful as we would have hoped by this time, with Pan Am Sports, in terms of the recognition and involvement of some of our associate members. You know, countries like St. Martin's, Curacao, Turks and Caicos, some of the other associate members. It just evades me at this point. I apologize for that. But what I can say is that we have had, within recent times, we have made significant progress in our lobbying efforts with in particular, the president of Pan Am Sports in Nevin Ellick. And he has committed, as soon as the COVID-19 restrictions and guidelines permit, to organize a meeting at Pan Am Sports offices in Miami with the associate members who are seeking to become members of Pan Am Sports. Myself as president of CANOC and Mr. Keith Joseph, the Secretary General of St. Vincent and Grenadines, who is the Secretary General of CANOC and also a Vice President of Pan Am Sports. So I'm eagerly anticipating that particular meeting because I'm going into that meeting with the clear objective that we will gain acceptance within Pan Am Sports for the associate members.
Okay, thank you very much, Mr. Lewis, for taking time out.
And that's sports. We'll be right back.
She's been watching, wondering, waiting for the sands of time to give way to a tide of change, when her seas can provide safe harbor to all who reach her shores, and her earthly embrace can soothe your soul. Let her sense of adventure set you free, and her everlasting stars twinkle in your honeymoon skies. She is St. Lucia. Let her inspire you.
Time now to take a look at some of the other stories that made headlines in the region's newspapers this week. The St. Lucia Times posted the headline, St. Lucia enacts tourism levy. The paper reported that the government will implement a new tax and revenue collected is earmarked for tourism marketing and development. Beginning December 1st, guest and registered accommodation service providers will be required to pay a prescribed nightly levy on their stay. Up north now to the Bahamas. The Nassau Guardian had news about government's plan to extend the state of emergency there. The paper reported that Prime Minister Dr. Hubert Minnis gave notice in the House of Assembly that he intends to seek Parliament's approval to extend the state of emergency to December 28th. Without an extension, the state of emergency would expire on November 30th. A headline in the St. Kitts Observer read, Barbados to Britain, stuff your turkeys. The paper reported that Barbados had banned the import of all poultry products from the UK due to an outbreak of the highly contagious bird flu called highly pathogenic avian influenza at a chicken farm in Cheshire, England. An immediate ban is also being enforced on the importation of personal imports of live birds, feathers, and food containing poultry products. And finally, in Antigua, the Antigua Observer printed a headline call for introduction of laws to protect severance payments for workers. The paper reported that a senior trade union official is reiterating for the enactment of laws to ensure that workers will receive severance and other entitlements due to them in the event that a company is forced to close. Samuel James, president of the Antigua and Barbuda Free Trade Union, says until this is done, thousands of workers in Antigua and Barbuda will continue to lose their years of service and other benefits. Those were some of the stories that made headlines across the region. And that's where we end Caribbean Week in Review. Join us again next week when we recap and discuss the stories that made headlines across the region. I'm Renee Sion.